The July sun scorched Red Mesa like the devil's own forge, turning every surface into blistering metal that could brand flesh with a careless touch. Heat waves shimmered off the wooden boardwalks like ghostly dancers, and even the hardiest desert creatures had retreated to whatever shade they could find. Clara Whitfield sat pressed against the Silver Horn Saloon's adobe wall, her 8-year-old frame reduced to skin stretched over bird bones, lips cracked white as old parchment. 2 months had passed since the masked riders murdered her parents on the Santa Fe Trail. 2 months since she'd watched her father's blood soak into desert sand while her mother's screams died under a moonless sky. The memory played behind her closed eyelids like a recurring nightmare. The thunder of hooves, the crack of gunfire. Her father pressing a leather pouch into her trembling hands with his dying breath. "Keep this safe, Clara," he had gasped as bullets tore through the stagecoach's wooden walls. "No matter what happens, promise me you'll keep it safe." She hadn't understood then why 3 folded papers mattered more than their lives. She still didn't understand, but she guarded them with the fierce loyalty of the utterly lost. With the pouch hanging around her neck like a talisman against a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty since that terrible night. The calico dress that had once been her mother's pride hung in tatters faded from cheerful blue to the color of despair itself. Dark stains marked the places where she'd tried to wash it in horse troughs before being chased away by angry proprietors. Her bare feet were cracked and bleeding from the unforgiving ground, and her stomach had long since stopped its demanding growls, settling into a hollow ache that seemed to echo through her entire body. Inside the Silver Horn, miners celebrated another silver strike with whiskey and cards. Their laughter echoed like mockery through the batwing doors, mixing with the sharp crack of poker chips and the scrape of chairs on wooden floors. The sounds of life and prosperity seemed to mock Clara's stillness, her silent desperation that had become as much a part of Red Mesa's landscape as the hitching posts and water troughs. She'd tried begging at first, approaching well-dressed ladies with trembling hands outstretched. But the women would clutch their purses tighter and hurry past their faces turned away as if poverty might be contagious. The men were worse. Some ignored her completely, while others looked at her with expressions that made her skin crawl and sent her scurrying back to her place by the saloon wall. A shadow fell across her face, different from the building's meager shade. Clara opened her eyes, expecting another soul to step around her misery, but met dark eyes that held recognition of suffering. The man was tall and weathered, dressed in practical buckskin that spoke of hard miles and harder choices. His black hair, streaked with premature silver, was bound with leather cord adorned with small blue beads. A single eagle feather marked him as Lakota, one of the peoples she'd been taught to fear. Clara shrank back against the wall, terror flooding her empty stomach. She'd heard the whispered stories in the months before her parents' death, scalping tortured children stolen in the night to be raised as savages. But this man's face held no menace, only a sadness that seemed to mirror her own. His weathered hands, scarred by old violence, held something wrapped in rough cloth that gave off a faint, pleasant smell. "You hunger," he said simply, his voice carrying an accent that somehow sounded like home, despite its foreign cadence. Not a question, but an acknowledgement of truth that no one else in Red Mesa had bothered to recognize. From the rough cloth, he unwrapped his last piece of pemmican-dried buffalo meat fat and berries pressed into sustenance that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Clara saw his own hollow cheeks, the careful way he handled food that clearly represented his final meal. This stranger was offering her everything he had. "Eat." "Tasunke wikasa," said, placing the precious gift in her trembling hands with the same reverence another man might show while handling gold. That single word shattered something inside her chest. Tears came, not the desperate sobs of a child seeking attention, but the quiet weeping of someone who had forgotten what compassion looked like. She bit into the pemmican tasting salt from her tears, mixed with the rich meat and sweet berries. The food awakened her deadened senses, reminding her body what nourishment felt like after weeks of slow starvation. "What is your name, little sister?" he asked when she could speak again. "Clara," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Clara Whitfield. I am Tasunke Wikasa, horseman in your tongue." He remained kneeling beside her, a shield between her vulnerability and the town's studied indifference. From across the street, Sheriff Vance watched with the cold calculation of a snake eyeing prey. Other faces appeared at windows, suspicious, hostile, threatened by the sight of an Indian, showing mercy to a white child, when respectable citizens had offered none. Clara could hear their muttered comments, feel their disapproval like a physical weight. "That savage has got no business with our children," someone said loud enough to carry across the dusty street. "Ought to be run out of town before he gets ideas above his station." Tasunke Wikasa's hand moved to the knife at his belt, not a threat, but a promise. Yet he showed restraint that spoke of hard-won wisdom, the patience of a man who had learned to choose his battles carefully. "Stay near people during daylight," he told Clara quietly, his voice urgent with warning. "This town holds darkness that would swallow a child whole. There are men here who see profit in misery, who would harm the innocent for coin." As he rose to leave, Clara felt hope drain from her chest like water from a broken vessel. But the warmth of food in her belly and the memory of kindness from a stranger sustained her as shadows lengthened across the unforgiving street. For the first time in 2 months, someone had seen her when the rest of the world looked away. She did not know that Tasunke Wikasa's simple act of mercy would set in motion events that would test them both beyond their limits, forge bonds stronger than blood, and transform a corrupt town into something worth believing in. She knew only that a man with gentle eyes had chosen compassion over indifference, sharing his last meal with a dying child when no one else would acknowledge her existence. The leather pouch around her neck seemed heavier now, though she still didn't understand its significance. All she understood was that someone in this harsh world had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. And that small act had kindled something inside her that she'd thought was dead forever. Hope. Tasunke Wikasa made his way to Murphy's livery stable as darkness claimed Red Mesa, his mind troubled by more than Clara's suffering. The sight of an abandoned child had awakened memories he'd tried to bury in the deepest corners of his heart, his wife Winona's gentle hands braiding sweetgrass, his son Little Wolf's laughter before cavalry sabers ended both in a dawn raid 3 winters past. He'd been away scouting for the army when the attack came, following orders to track Cheyenne raiders, while his own family lay defenseless in their winter lodge. By the time he returned, nothing remained but ashes and unmarked graves. The guilt had driven him south from the Powder River country, seeking distance from memories that haunted his dreams and waking hours alike. Murphy, the Irish stable owner, was a weathered man with knowing eyes who charged fair prices and asked few questions. Missing 2 fingers from an old mining accident, he possessed the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker impulses. "Saw you talking to the Whitfield girl," he said as Tasunke Wikasa settled his horse in a stall. "Good on you. Rest of this godforsaken town acts like she's got the plague, or worse, like she's invisible. She has family here. None that'll claim her." Murphy spat in the straw, his disgust evident. "Parents were killed up near Wagon Mound 2 months back, supposedly by road agents. Highway robbery, Sheriff Vance called it, but there's talk it was more particular than that." Tasunke Wikasa looked up from his saddlebags, interest sharpening. What manner of talk? Henry Whitfield wasn't just any traveler. Murphy replied, lowering his voice instinctively. He was a surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, carried maps and legal papers worth more than most folks see in a lifetime. Important business, the kind that makes enemies of powerful men. The pieces of a larger puzzle began forming in Tasunke Wikasa's mind. Railroad surveyors were often targeted for their knowledge of mineral deposits and land grants documents that could be worth fortunes if they fell into the wrong hands. The attack on Clara's family was beginning to sound less like random violence and more like calculated murder. The robbers, he pressed. Were they caught? Murphy's expression grew darker. That's where the story gets interesting. Word is the bandits took everything valuable from the stagecoach, but they spent a powerful long time searching for something specific. Tore that coach apart board by board like they knew exactly what they were hunting. And the child survived how? Pure luck, seems like. Found hiding under some brush a quarter-mile from the wreckage, scared senseless and covered in her parents' blood. Been sitting outside that saloon ever since, and not one soul in Red Mesa has lifted a finger to help her. Tasunke Wikasa felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had consumed him after finding his family's burned lodge. But this time, perhaps, he could prevent tragedy, rather than simply mourning it after the fact. "This Granger who owns the saloon," he said carefully. "What manner of man is he?" Murphy's face went carefully neutral, but his eyes revealed everything. Elias Granger came west after the war with more money than any honest Confederate officer should have had. Bought himself a piece of New Mexico territory and started squeezing folks for what he calls protection. Sheriff Vance takes his orders same as everyone else. And Clara threatens his business how? Maybe she doesn't, Murphy admitted. Or maybe she does in ways we don't understand yet. All I know is that Child's been sitting out there for 2 months, and suddenly everyone's acting like she's got something they want or something they fear. As if summoned by their conversation, muffled voices drifted from the alley behind the Silver Horn. Tasunke Wikasa moved to the stable's rear window, peering through dusty glass toward the saloon's back entrance, where 2 figures moved with predatory stealth. "Granger says it's got to be tonight," one whispered urgently. "Kid's been drawing too much attention since that Indian fed her. Bad for business, he says, having beggars cluttering up the place. What's he want done with her?" The second voice carried reluctance, as if its owner retained some vestige of conscience. "Canyon Creek Mining Camp needs kitchen help," came the reply. "Girl that size won't eat much, won't cost much to feed, and who's gonna ask questions about another disappeared orphan? She vanishes, problem solved." Ice water filled Tasunke Wikasa's veins as he recognized the casual evil of men discussing the sale of a child as if she were livestock. Canyon Creek was notorious throughout the territory, a place where unwanted people vanished into forced labor and unmarked graves, where the law never ventured and questions were answered with bullets. He checked his weapons methodically, a Henry repeating rifle, a skinning knife honed to razor sharpness, and a tomahawk that had served him well in darker times. The odds were poor, but he'd faced worse situations during his years as an Army scout. The difference was that this time, he was fighting not for abstract principles of duty, but for the life of an innocent child who had already suffered more than any human being should have to bear. The attack came just after midnight, when the saloon's noise had died to a murmur, and the streets were empty except for a few drunks stumbling home through the dust. Tasunke Wikasa had been watching from the shadows when 2 men emerged from the Silver Horn's back door and moved toward Clara's sleeping form with practiced efficiency. Jake Morrison was a whiskey-soaked ranch hand who spent most of his wages on cards and rot-gut liquor, a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of decency. His companion was a stranger with a scarred face and the cold eyes of a professional killer, probably brought in specifically for this kind of wet work. They approached Clara with the confidence of predators who had done this before, one man moving to cover her mouth while the other prepared to lift her bodily. She woke as Morrison's calloused hand clamped over her face, her eyes wide with terror above his palm, as she found herself being dragged toward whatever fate Granger had arranged. Tasunke Wikasa emerged from the darkness like death itself, moving with the fluid precision of a warrior who had learned to kill efficiently in defense of those who could not protect themselves. His skinning knife found the scarred man's heart before either kidnapper knew they were no longer alone, the blade sliding between ribs with surgical accuracy. Morrison released Clara and spun around, half drawing his gun, but the tomahawk was already spinning through the air. It caught him in the forehead with a wet crunch that ended his participation in Granger's schemes, and dropped him beside his partner in the spreading pool of blood that looked black in the moonlight. Clara stumbled backward, her small body shaking with shock as she stared at the violence that had erupted so suddenly in her defense. The acrid smell of death began to mix with the familiar odors of horses and hay that drifted from the stable, creating a sensory memory that would haunt her dreams for years to come. "Are you hurt?" Tasunke Wikasa asked quietly, wiping his blade clean on Morrison's shirt, while his eyes swept the surrounding darkness for additional threats. Clara shook her head, unable to speak. She was staring at the bodies, at the sudden transition from sleep to terror, to rescue that had left her mind reeling with possibilities she'd never imagined. "Look at me, not them," Tasunke Wikasa said firmly, kneeling beside her with gentle hands that had just delivered death with ruthless efficiency. "You are safe now. They cannot hurt you or sell you to anyone." "I heard them talking," Clara whispered, finding her voice at last. "They said Mr. Granger wanted me taken somewhere awful where no one would miss me or ask questions about what happened." The words confirmed Tasunke Wikasa's worst fears about the corruption that had infected Red Mesa like a cancer. Granger wasn't content to simply ignore Clara's plight. He actively wanted her removed, either because her presence was bad for business or because she represented some other kind of threat to his interests. Bootsteps echoed from the saloon's front porch as someone came to check on the kidnapping operation. Sheriff Vance's voice carried through the night air, calling for Morrison and his partner. When no answer came, the corrupt lawman would investigate, and their brief window of opportunity would slam shut. "We need to leave this place," Tasunke Wikasa said, helping Clara to her feet while his mind raced through escape options. "Granger will know something has gone wrong when these men don't return with you." They had barely reached Murphy's stable when the old Irishman appeared with a cavalry carbine in his weathered hands and determination written across his features. His missing fingers didn't seem to hamper his grip on the weapon as he gestured toward his best horse. "Take the bay mare," Murphy said without preamble, his brogue thick with emotion. "She'll carry you both true, and she knows trails these desert rats couldn't follow blindfolded." "Why risk this?" Tasunke Wikasa asked as he quickly saddled the animal, knowing that helping them would mark Murphy as an enemy of powerful men. "Granger will blame you for our escape." Murphy's smile held bitter memory and Irish stubbornness in equal measure. "Because I got grandchildren back in Kansas about her age, and because some things a man can't watch happen and still look at himself in a mirror. Besides, I've tangled with worse than Elias Granger in my time." Gunfire erupted from the alley as Granger's remaining men discovered the bodies of their associates. Shouts filled the night air, and the sound of running feet grew closer with each passing second. Tasunke Wikasa lifted Clara onto the mare's back and swung up behind her, his rifle ready and his few possessions abandoned in the rush to escape. Sheriff Vance appeared at the stable's corner just as they rode into the street, his pistol raised and his face twisted with rage at seeing his employer's plans disrupted. The lawman's shot went wide, the bullet splintering wood from a hitching post as the bay mare leaped forward into a gallop that carried them beyond accurate range. More gunfire followed the muzzle flashes, lighting up the night like deadly fireflies, but the horse was already gaining speed with every stride. Clara clung to the saddle horn, her small body pressed against Tasunke Wikasa's chest as they thundered through Red Mesa's empty streets toward the vast darkness of the desert beyond. "Where are we going?" Clara asked above the drumming of hooves on packed earth. "Away from here," Tasunke Wikasa replied, though he was not entirely certain of their ultimate destination. To people who judge by actions rather than appearance, who understand that some things are worth fighting for. As they reached the edge of town and struck out across the open desert, Red Mesa's lights began to fade behind them, like dying embers. But the sound of pursuit was already beginning. Horses being saddled, men shouting orders, and the general alarm that meant their brief head start was all they would get. Behind them lay a town ruled by corruption and fear. Ahead stretched the unknown territory of the high desert, where allies and enemies often wore the same faces and survival depended on courage, cunning, and the kind of loyalty that transcended every artificial boundary society might create. The hunt had begun in earnest, and with it a journey that would test every virtue against the brutal arithmetic of frontier justice. 3 days of relentless desert travel brought them to the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where ancient volcanic rock created a maze of canyons and hidden valleys that had sheltered fugitives since the first Spanish explorers crossed these lands centuries before. Tasunke Wicasa knew this country from his scouting days, when he had tracked Apache raiders and army deserters through terrain that could hide an entire war party or swallow a lone traveler without leaving so much as a footprint. Clara had proven tougher than her fragile appearance suggested, accepting hardship with the stoic endurance of someone who had already learned that complaints accomplished nothing, and weakness invited exploitation. She spoke little during their trek, conserving energy for the serious business of survival, but her eyes remained alert to everything around them and the flight of birds that might indicate water, the arrangement of rocks that could provide shelter, the subtle signs that separated safe passage from deadly trap. Their horse was showing signs of exhaustion, despite its sturdy construction, foam flecking its muzzle as they climbed higher into country, where the air grew thin and water became increasingly precious. They had pushed the animal hard to stay ahead of pursuit, and even the best mount had limits that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. On the morning of the 4th day, as they descended toward a creek lined with golden aspen trees that promised both water and concealment, Clara suddenly grabbed Tasunke Wicasa's arm and pointed toward a column of smoke rising in the distance, like a dark finger against the pale sky. "Is that a town?" she asked, hope evident in her voice, despite her efforts to remain cautious about every new development. Tasunke Wicasa studied the smoke with practiced eyes, noting its color and density, with the expertise of a man who had spent years reading such signs for information about friend or foe. "No, little sister. That is a campfire, maybe 2 or 3. Could be travelers resting, could be trouble waiting. We approach with great care." They used the cover of deadfall timber and thick brush to mask their advance, moving with the patience of hunters who understood that haste could mean death in country, where every shadow might hide an enemy. The process took the better part of an hour, but Tasunke Wicasa had learned during his army service that reconnaissance was never time wasted. What they found was both better and worse than expected: a small wagon train of Mexican traders, their canvas-covered carretas, arranged in a defensive circle around a central fire, where men in practical clothing went about the morning routine of breaking camp. The freighters were armed, but not obviously hostile, their weapons carried with the casual competence of men who made their living, traveling dangerous roads where bandits and hostile tribes were constant threats. Their leader was a stocky man with graying beard and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, the kind of professional trader who had survived decades on the frontier by reading situations accurately and making smart decisions quickly. He noticed Tasunke Wicasa's approach immediately and stepped forward with the wary courtesy of someone who had learned that strangers could bring either opportunity or disaster. "Buenos dias, amigo." The man said in Spanish, then switched to accented English when he saw Clara. "I am Luis Ortega, and these are my associates. You travel with a child in dangerous country. Perhaps we can help each other reach safer ground. I am called Horseman." Tasunke Wicasa replied, giving the English translation of his Lakota name while keeping his rifle ready for quick use. "We seek safe passage north to the Arkansas River country. We can pay for food and assistance." Ortega's eyes sharpened with interest that seemed excessive for a routine encounter with travelers seeking basic aid. "A child, you say? A little girl?" What is her name, this pequeña? Something in the trader's tone set off warning bells in Tasunke Wikasa's mind. The question carried too much weight, as if Ortega already knew about Clara's existence, and was merely confirming details he had learned from other sources. But hunger and exhaustion had made them desperate, and the smell of cooking bacon was almost overwhelming after days of cold camps and foraged food that barely sustained life. "Clara," he called softly, knowing that concealment would only delay an inevitable confrontation. "Come out, but stay close to me, and be ready to run if I give the word." She emerged from the brush with obvious reluctance, her hand instinctively moving to the leather pouch around her neck, in a gesture that had become second nature during their flight. The Mexican traders studied her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something darker and more calculating, like men appraising valuable merchandise. Ortega smiled, but the expression carried no warmth or genuine friendliness. "Ah, see, the little Rubia from Red Mesa. There has been much talk about this one along all the trading routes between here and Santa Fe. Much money offered for information about her whereabouts." The admission confirmed Tasunke Wikasa's fears about how far their enemy's influence extended. Word of their flight had spread beyond Granger's immediate reach, probably carried by riders who used the established trade networks to spread bounty notices throughout the territory. They were no longer dealing with local corruption, but with a web of greed and violence that stretched across hundreds of miles. What kind of talk? Tasunke Wikasa asked, his hand moving closer to his weapon, while his eyes counted the number of armed men now casually surrounding them. "The kind that pays very well for results." Ortega replied, dropping all pretense of friendliness, as his men began spreading out in a loose semicircle designed to prevent escape. $500 in gold for the girl delivered alive to Red Mesa. 200 for proof of your death. Not bad wages for a morning's work in these hard times, wouldn't you agree? Clara pressed closer to Tasunke Wikasa's side as the Mexican traders revealed their true intentions, weapons appearing with practiced ease in hands that had clearly done this kind of work before. 7 men against 1 with a child to protect the odds were hopeless in any direct confrontation. But surrender meant Clara's delivery to whatever fate Granger had planned for her. You would sell a child to men like Granger? Tasunke Wikasa asked, genuinely curious about the depth of moral corruption that would allow such transactions. "She has done nothing to harm you or yours." Ortega shrugged with the casual indifference of a man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of conscience in favor of profit. "Business is business, amigo. Nothing personal in it. The girl is worth money to the right people, and we are businessmen first and foremost. Survival requires practical thinking. Then this becomes very personal to me." Tasunke Wikasa replied quietly, his finger moving to his rifle's trigger. The first shot came without further warning, taking Ortega in the chest and dropping him beside his morning cook fire before the trader could draw his own weapon. The impact spun him around like a child's toy blood, spreading across his white shirt as he collapsed among the scattered coals and camping equipment. The remaining men scattered for cover, cursing in rapid Spanish as bullets began flying in both directions across the camp. Clara dove behind the nearest wagon wheel, making herself as small as possible while the battle raged around her with deadly intensity that turned the peaceful morning into a war zone. Tasunke Wikasa used the wagons themselves as cover, moving from cart to cart with fluid precision as the Mexicans tried to flank him while avoiding the crossfire that filled the air with buzzing death. His ammunition was running low again, each shot precious, and carefully aimed at targets that appeared and vanished among the chaos of scattered equipment and frightened horses. The tide of battle turned when one of the carretas caught fire, probably from an overturned cooking pot or scattered coals from the breakfast fire that had been kicked into the dry canvas during the fighting. The flames spread with terrifying speed, sending smoke and sparks billowing across the camp and creating confusion that Tasunke Wikasa was quick to exploit. In the chaos of the burning wagon, He managed to reach the traders' horse lines and cut loose their mounts with sharp blows and shouted commands in Lakota. The animals scattered across the meadow, their hoofbeats fading into the distance as they fled the smoke and gunfire. Without their horses, the surviving Mexicans would be stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies and a long walk back to civilization. The girl, one of the remaining gunmen, shouted through the smoke and confusion, his voice cracking with desperation. "Don't let her get away. Granger will have our hides if we lose her now." But Clara was already moving, following Tasunke Wicasa toward the creek, where aspen trees offered better cover than the burning camp. A bullet splintered bark inches from her head as they reached the water, but they managed to splash across and disappear into the golden grove on the far side before their enemies could organize effective pursuit. Behind them, the burning wagon sent a pillar of black smoke into the morning sky, a signal that would be visible for miles in any direction, and would certainly draw attention from anyone who might be following their trail. If Granger's men were still pursuing them, the smoke would act like a beacon guiding them straight to this location. "We cannot stay in this area," Tasunke Wicasa said, as they caught their breath in a thicket of wild roses, blood seeping through his shirt from a bullet graze across his shoulder. "Too many people know about us now. The bounty on your head has made us targets for every desperate man with a gun between here and Mexico. But where can we go?" Clara asked the question that had become a constant refrain, as each temporary refuge proved to be another trap waiting to spring. "It feels like the whole world is hunting us." Tasunke Wicasa considered their dwindling options while testing the movement in his wounded shoulder. The high country to the north was approaching winter with snow already visible on the peaks that would make travel impossible for anyone not prepared for Arctic conditions. The desert to the south led back toward Red Mesa and certain death. East lay the Great Plains, where his people had once roamed free, but now existed only in reservation confinement or scattered exile like himself. "There is a place," he said, finally, decision crystallizing as he spoke. "A trading post called Bent's Fork, where the Arkansas River bends toward the mountains. The owner is James Bridger, a man who judges others by their actions rather than their ancestry or the color of their skin. There are others there who owe me favors from the old days when we fought together against common enemies." "How far?" Clara asked, already mentally preparing herself for another grueling trek across unforgiving terrain. 4 days' walk, maybe 5, if we must avoid the main trails and stay clear of settlements where bounty hunters might be waiting with wanted posters." Clara nodded with the solemn acceptance of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary, and comfort was a luxury they could not afford. She helped him bind his shoulder wound with strips torn from her already tattered dress, her small fingers surprisingly steady as she tied the knots that would hold the makeshift bandage in place. As they prepared to leave the creek bottom, a new sound reached their ears, the distant rumble of many horses moving fast across hard ground, accompanied by the shouts of men who had found what they were looking for. Their fight with the Mexican traders had indeed served as a beacon drawing fresh pursuit from Red Mesa, or perhaps from other sources entirely. "They are coming," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying no surprise, but also no surrender. "Yes." Tasunke Wicasa agreed, checking his remaining ammunition and finding it discouragingly limited. "But we are still ahead of them, and the mountains offer many places to hide if we can reach them before they close the distance." What he did not tell her was that his wounded shoulder was stiffening rapidly, that the approaching winter would make survival in the high country almost impossible for a child, and that each mile they traveled was carrying them deeper into wilderness that was as dangerous as any human enemy they might face. But as Clara took his uninjured hand and prepared to follow him into the unknown once again, Tasunke Wicasa felt the same fierce pride in her courage that had sustained him through their previous ordeals. This small girl had watched her parents die had been abandoned by her community, and had survived multiple attempts at kidnapping and murder. Yet she continued to fight, continued to hope, continued to trust in his ability to keep her safe. That trust was both burden and blessing, driving him forward when exhaustion and pain might have counseled surrender. Clara Whitfield was depending on him completely, and he would not fail her as he had failed his own family when the cavalry came, in the gray dawn 3 years ago. The sound of pursuit grew closer as they struck out across the high meadows, heading toward distant peaks where snow and stone might provide the sanctuary that human mercy had denied them. Behind them, smoke from the burning wagon continued to mark their position like a giant arrow pointing toward their desperate flight. But ahead lay the possibility of allies of men who remembered old debts and honored old friendships regardless of the dangers such loyalty might bring. If they could reach Bent's Fork, if James Bridger proved as honorable as memory suggested, then perhaps they could find not just temporary shelter, but the support they needed to finally turn and face their enemies on ground of their own choosing. The chase was far from over. But for the first time since leaving Red Mesa, they were running towards something rather than merely away from it. And in that subtle shift lay the seeds of hope that had sustained travelers in this harsh land since the first humans crossed the mountains in search of better tomorrows. The trading post at Bent's Fork squatted beside the Arkansas River like a fortress built of necessity and defended by reputation. Its thick adobe walls scarred by weather and warfare, but still standing after decades of frontier violence. Tasunke Wikasa had first seen this place 15 years earlier as a young scout when the beaver trade was dying, and the great buffalo herds still darkened the plains for days at a time before progress and greed had driven them to near extinction. Now, Bent's Fork served as a gathering point for the scattered remnants of the old frontier mountain men, whose trap lines had played out cavalry veterans seeking anonymous refuge from memories too painful to bear, and displaced Lakota like himself who lived between worlds that no longer welcomed them with open arms. James Bridger was a legend in his own time, a man who had seen more of the American West than any living soul, and who had earned his reputation through courage, cunning, and an unshakable code of honor that made him friends among people who were supposed to be enemies. His weathered face had looked upon wonders that eastern city dwellers could barely imagine, geysers that shot boiling water toward the sky, mountains that scraped the belly of heaven, and valleys where a man could ride for days without seeing another human soul. When Tasunke Wikasa and Clara stumbled through his gates after 5 days of hard travel through increasingly hostile territory, Bridger took one look at their condition and ordered his Mexican wife to prepare food and medicine without asking a single question about their circumstances. It was a courtesy that spoke to both his practical wisdom and his fundamental decency. Questions could wait until immediate needs were addressed. "You look like hell, horseman," Bridger observed with characteristic directness as Clara wolfed down her first hot meal in a week. "Someone's been trying real hard to kill you, I'd say, and doing a thorough job of the attempt. Someone succeeded in killing her parents." Tasunke Wikasa replied, nodding toward Clara as she concentrated on eating with the focused intensity of someone who had learned not to waste opportunities for nourishment. Now, they want to finish what they started with the girl. Bridger's weathered face grew serious as he absorbed the implications. He had spent too many years on the frontier to dismiss such statements lightly, and his network of contacts throughout the territory meant he was often better informed about developing situations than the territorial government itself. "Who's after you?" he asked, settling into a chair that creaked under his substantial weight. "A man named Granger in Red Mesa. Claims to own a saloon, but his real business seems to be owning the town itself and everyone in it who matters. Elias Granger." Bridger said thoughtfully, his expression darkening with recognition and distaste. "Yeah, I heard plenty about him. Ex-Confederate officer who came west after the war with more money than any honest soldier should have had, especially one who supposedly lost everything in the surrender. bought himself a piece of New Mexico territory and started squeezing folks for what he calls protection money, like some kind of feudal lord. He paused, studying Clara with shrewd eyes that had evaluated dangerous situations for more than half a century. What makes the girl so special that Granger would chase her clean across the territory with hired guns and bounty hunters? It was Clara herself who answered, looking up from her plate with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. My father was a surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. He had papers, important ones, that men were willing to kill for. The robbers who murdered my parents wanted those documents more than they wanted our money or horses. Bridger's expression sharpened with understanding, born of long experience with frontier politics and the deadly games played for wealth and power. Railroad surveying was dangerous work in the best of times, but the legal documents that accompanied such expeditions often represented fortunes in land grants and mineral rights that could make or break entire communities. "What kind of papers, child?" he asked, gently, his voice carrying the patience of a man who understood that traumatized people needed time to tell their stories properly. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the leather pouch around her neck, the gesture so automatic that she seemed unaware of making it. The worn leather showed signs of long handling, and something about its appearance tugged at memories that Tasunke Wikesa could not quite bring into focus, a nagging sense of familiarity that hovered just beyond conscious recognition. "Land grants," Daddy said. "Something about mineral rights that would be worth a fortune to the right people. But I never understood what any of it meant. He tried to explain it to me once, but the legal language was too complicated for a child to follow." Tasunke Wikasa had wondered about that pouch since their first meeting outside the Silverhorn Saloon, noting how Clara guarded it like a sacred relic and derived comfort from its presence even in the darkest moments of their flight. The pouch itself seemed oddly familiar, as if he had seen its distinctive markings somewhere before, but the memory remained tantalizingly out of reach. "Maybe it's time we found out what's so important," Bridger suggested with the practical wisdom of a man who had learned that secrets could be more dangerous than bullets. "If you're willing, child. Sometimes knowing the truth is the only way to figure out how to survive it." Clara looked at Tasunke Wikasa, seeking reassurance from the man who had become her protector and guide. When he nodded encouragingly, she slowly lifted the pouch over her head and placed it on the rough wooden table between them, with the solemnity of someone handling a religious artifact. The leather was worn smooth by years of careful handling, and the rawhide cord showed signs of recent repairs where it had been cut and retied during the attack that killed her parents. Inside were 3 folded documents, their official seals still intact, despite the rough treatment they had received during the long journey from that blood-soaked stretch of the Santa Fe Trail. Bridger examined them carefully, his lips moving silently as he worked through the formal legal language that constituted territorial land grants. His expression grew increasingly amazed as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief at the scope of what the documents represented. "Sweet Jesus Christ," he breathed, finally setting the papers on the table with hands that were not entirely steady. "No wonder Granger wants you dead, child. These aren't just any land grants. These are mineral rights to 3 full sections along Willow Creek, about 20 miles northeast of Red Mesa." "Is that valuable?" Clara asked, though the answer was already written in Bridger's expression of awe and concern. "Valuable." Bridger looked up from the documents with something approaching reverence. "Child, there's silver in them hills. Rich silver, or the kind that men abandon everything they know to come digging in the desert for. These papers represent legal ownership of what might be the biggest strike in New Mexico territory since the Spanish first started mining these mountains 3 centuries ago." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place with devastating clarity for Tasunke Wikasa. Henry Whitfield had not been a random victim of frontier violence, but a specific target in a carefully planned murder designed to steal documents worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. Granger had known about the Silver Strike, had probably learned about it through his network of corrupt officials and desperate informants. But the legal ownership of the mineral rights stood in his way like an insurmountable obstacle. So he had my parents killed to steal the papers. Clara said, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that no child should have to bear. That's about the size of it, Bridger confirmed grimly. And now, you're the only legal heir to a fortune that could make you one of the wealthiest people in the territory. That makes you worth more dead than alive to a man like Granger, because as long as you're breathing, you can challenge his claim to what rightfully belongs to you. Tasunke Wikasa felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to kill Morrison and Slocum and the Mexican traders who had tried to sell Clara like livestock. But this was bigger than personal revenge now. This was about justice for a murdered family and the future of an orphaned child who deserved better than what the world had given her. Har. There's something else, Bridger said quietly, still studying the papers with the intense focus of a man who had learned to read between the lines of legal documents. Look at this witness signature on the third document. Tasunke Wikasa leaned closer and felt his blood turn to ice water as recognition flooded through him. The witness signature belonged to Captain William Custer, 7th Cavalry, dated just 3 weeks before the disaster at Little Bighorn that had claimed the flamboyant officer's life. Below it, in the same confident handwriting, was a personal note that made his hands tremble as he read. Should anything happen to Mr. Whitfield during his survey work, his daughter Clara is to be placed under the protection of the Lakota scout who saved my life during the Powder River expedition. He will recognize her by this token, and honor demands that he accept this responsibility as payment of a debt that can never be fully repaid. The room seemed to spin around Tasunke Wikasa as memories came flooding back with the force of a flash flood in a narrow canyon. 3 years earlier, during the bitter fighting along the Powder River, Captain Custer's patrol had been ambushed by Cheyenne warriors seeking revenge for earlier cavalry raids on their winter camps. In the confused battle that followed, Custer had been separated from his men and cornered in a box canyon with no apparent escape route. Tasunke Wikasa had found him there, wounded, and facing certain death at the hands of enemies who had learned to hate the yellow-haired cavalry officer with a passion that transcended ordinary warfare. Despite the complex politics that surrounded his service as an Army scout, despite the growing tensions between his own people and the soldiers he guided, Tasunke Wikasa had helped Custer escape through a hidden deer trail that only a native tracker could have spotted. The captain had sworn eternal gratitude, promising that if Tasunke Wikasa ever needed help, he had only to present himself at any Army post and mention the Powder River incident to receive whatever assistance the military could provide. It was a debt of honor that Custer had taken seriously enough to include provisions for its payment in his legal business, even though he could not have known that his own death was approaching with each passing day. You saved Custer's life. Clara asked, her eyes wide with amazement at this revelation. Tasunke Wikasa nodded slowly, still trying to process the implications of this connection that reached across the divide between past and present, between the living and the dead. 3 years ago, during the fighting along the Powder River, he was a brave soldier, reckless perhaps, but honorable in his way. I found him wounded and surrounded by enemies who would have shown no mercy to the man they called Longhair. And now he's returned the favor from beyond the grave. Bridger observed with the wonder of a man who had witnessed many strange turns of fate, but never one quite like this. That's the kind of honor that made Custer a legend even among the people who fought against him. The weight of destiny seemed to settle on Tasunke Wikasa's shoulders like a physical burden. What he had seen as a simple act of kindness, sharing food with a hungry child, was revealed to be part of a larger pattern, a debt of honor that reached across the divide between white and red, between the living and the dead, between past actions and present consequences. As if summoned by their conversation about the past, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the trading post's courtyard. multiple riders moving with purpose, rather than the casual pace of normal travelers seeking supplies or shelter. Bridger moved quickly to the window, his hand instinctively going to the rifle that leaned against the wall as he peered through the dusty glass. Riders coming in fast. He announced grimly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced desperate situations more times than he cared to remember. 8 or 9 of them, and they don't look like they're here for friendly conversation or honest trade. Tasunke Wikasa joined him at the window and felt his heart sink as he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Vance from Red Mesa, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun like a symbol of corruption rather than law and order. Behind him rode men who could only be professional killers, armed to the teeth and moving with the confidence of hunters who had finally cornered their prey after a long and frustrating chase. "They found us." Clara whispered, her face pale with the terror of someone who had thought herself safe, only to discover that safety was an illusion in a world where money could buy anything, including death. How did they track us here? Tasunke Wikasa wondered aloud, though the answer mattered less than their immediate need to survive the confrontation that was about to begin. Bridger was already moving, gathering weapons and ammunition with the efficiency of a man who had faced desperate situations before, and understood that survival often depended on quick thinking and decisive action. "Don't matter how they found us," he said curtly. "What matters is they're here, and they mean to finish what they started back in Red Mesa." His 3 employees, 2 grizzled mountain men named Pete and Johnny, plus a half-breed Crow Scout called Running Wolf, had already taken positions at strategic windows, without being told, their rifles loaded and their faces set, with the grim determination of men who had chosen their side and would see it through to whatever end awaited them. Sheriff Vance's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, amplified by the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "James Bridger, we know you got that Indian and the girl in there. Send them out peaceable-like, and nobody else needs to get hurt. This is official territorial business." Bridger responded by cocking his rifle with a sound that echoed like thunder in the small room. "Like hell it is," he muttered, his weathered face set in lines of stubborn determination. "This is my place, and I decide who's welcome and who gets shown the door at gunpoint." The siege of Bent's Fork was about to begin, and with it, the most dangerous test that Tasunke Wikasa and Clara had yet faced. But now they understood the stakes. This was not just about survival, but about justice for a murdered family and the future of a child who had been revealed to be the rightful heir to a silver fortune. The final confrontation with Granger's forces would determine whether law or corruption prevailed in the New Mexico territory, whether an orphaned girl would claim her inheritance or disappear forever into the vast wilderness that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Clara Whitfield was no longer just a starving waif who had been shown kindness by a stranger. She was the key to one of the territory's greatest mineral discoveries, and the only obstacle standing between Elias Granger and the fortune he had killed to obtain. The real battle was just beginning, and everything they had endured to reach this point had been merely preparation for the final test that would determine their fate and the fate of everyone who had chosen to stand with them against corruption and greed. The attack came with the setting sun, when the dying light made accurate shooting difficult, and shadows provided cover for men who understood how to use darkness as a weapon. Sheriff Vance had positioned his hired killers in a rough circle around Bent's Fork, cutting off all escape routes while maintaining their position just beyond effective rifle range of the trading post's defenders. The assault began with probing shots designed to test the resolve and capabilities of the people inside. Bullets chipped adobe from the walls and shattered window glass. But the return fire was accurate enough to keep the attackers honest and respectful of the range. "They're being careful," Bridger observed from his position near the main window. "Testing our defenses, seeing where we're strong and where we might be vulnerable to a concentrated assault." Inside the thick adobe walls, The trading post had been transformed into a fortress prepared for siege warfare. Pete and Johnny, the two mountain men, had taken positions that commanded the main approaches, their rifles loaded with enough ammunition to make any direct assault costly. Running Wolf covered the rear entrance, his half-breed heritage, giving him insights into both white and Indian tactics that might prove valuable in the coming fight. Tasunke Wikasa crouched beside a window that offered a view of the river approach, his own rifle ready, but his ammunition carefully counted and rationed. Beside him, Clara pressed herself against the wall, still clutching the leather pouch that had revealed her true importance to their enemies and to the larger struggle for justice in the territory. "How long can we hold them?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the fear that any sensible person would feel in such circumstances. "As long as we have bullets and they keep their distance," Bridger replied with characteristic honesty. "But that won't be forever. Come full dark, they'll try to get closer, maybe set fire to the roof, or rush the main gate with overwhelming numbers." As if his words had been a prophecy, muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the trading post, as Vance's men opened up with a coordinated volley designed to pin down the defenders, while other attackers moved to better positions. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and bullets buzzed through the air like angry hornets, seeking targets among the men who dared to resist Granger's will. The defenders returned fire methodically, each shot carefully aimed at the fleeting targets that appeared and vanished in the growing darkness. Tasunke Wikasa's first shot took down one of the flanking gunmen who had tried to use the riverbank for cover. The man's cry of pain and surprise carrying clearly across the water before being cut short forever. The siege continued through the night, the attackers maintaining steady pressure with sporadic gunfire while probing for weaknesses in the post's defenses. Their tactics suggested military training and experience with this kind of warfare. The patient approach of professionals who understood that time was on their side. It was near midnight when disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Flaming arrows began arcing through the darkness, landing on the trading post's wooden roof, where the dry shingles caught fire despite the defenders' attempts to douse them with precious water from their barrels. Within minutes, flames were spreading across the structure, filling the interior with smoke that made breathing difficult and forced the defenders away from their carefully chosen positions. "We can't stay here much longer," Bridger shouted over the crackling of burning timber and the increased tempo of gunfire from outside. "The whole place is going up like a torch." Through the smoke and confusion, Tasunke Wikasa could see their enemies closing in dark figures moving across the courtyard with weapons ready. This was the moment Vance had been waiting for, the chance to finish his business with overwhelming force, while the fire provided both distraction and justification for any violence that followed. The root seller, Running Wolf, called out, pointing toward a trap door set into the floor near the back wall. "There's a tunnel that leads to the riverbank." Bridger dug it during the Apache troubles 5 years back when things got really desperate. They had no choice but to trust in the Crow Scout's knowledge and Bridger's foresight. Clara went first, disappearing into the dark hole with the quick adaptability of youth, followed by the wounded Pete and then Tasunke Wikasa. Bridger and Running Wolf came last, pulling the trap door closed behind them just as the main door burst open and Sheriff Vance's killers poured into the burning building. The tunnel was narrow and low-carved from the earth and rock by desperate hands during a previous siege. Clara crawled ahead of them in total darkness, guided only by the faint current of air that promised an exit somewhere beyond the reach of their enemies' guns. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the crash of falling timbers as the fire consumed Bridger's accumulated wealth and memories. They emerged from the tunnel into a thick stand of willows along the Arkansas River, gasping for breath and covered with dirt from their underground passage. The trading post was fully engulfed, now flames reaching toward the star-filled sky, while dark figures moved around the perimeter like demons celebrating the destruction of everything Bridger had built over decades of hard work and careful accumulation. 40 years. Bridger said quietly, watching his life's work turn to ash and cinders. Every pelt I ever traded, every friend I ever helped, every memory I made in this country. All gone because I chose to do the right thing for a child who needed help. Clara looked up at the old mountain man, with tears streaming down her dirt-stained face, understanding that her presence had brought this destruction to someone who had shown her nothing but kindness and protection. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of guilt that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Bridger knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Don't be sorry for being alive, little sister. Don't be sorry for having something worth fighting for. That trading post was just wood and adobe. It could be rebuilt if a man had the will and the time. But once you're dead, there's no coming back from that, and the world would be a poorer place without Clara Whitfield in it." But their immediate problem was survival in hostile territory, with limited supplies and enemies who would not abandon their pursuit easily. They were on foot now, with winter approaching, and the nearest friendly settlement days away, through country where water was scarce and shelter was non-existent. There's a Lakota camp 3 days north of here. Running Wolf said his knowledge of tribal movements, making him invaluable, despite the complications his mixed heritage created in dealing with both white and Indian communities. "My cousin married into the band, and they owe me for warning them about a cavalry patrol last spring that would have caught them with their winter supplies exposed." "Will they take us in?" Tasunke Wikasa asked, knowing that displaced bands were often reluctant to accept additional burdens when their own survival was uncertain. "Maybe," Running Wolf replied honestly. "Depends on whether they think helping you is worth the trouble it might bring from territorial authorities and men like Granger, who have influence with the army." As the flames from Bent's Fork died down to glowing embers, Sheriff Vance and his surviving gunmen would soon realize that their quarry had escaped once again. The hunt would resume at first light, and this time there would be no mercy shown. No attempt to take prisoners who might prove inconvenient witnesses to the crimes that had been committed. It was then that Clara made a decision that surprised everyone present with its maturity and unexpected boldness. "I don't want to keep running," she said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to come from some deep well of resolve that none of them had suspected existed. "I'm tired of being hunted like an animal, tired of good people like Mr. Bridger losing everything because they tried to help me. Child, we don't have much choice in the matter," Bridger said gently. "Granger's got the law on his side, or at least his version of it. Running's about the only option we got left." "No," Clara replied with growing conviction. "There's another way. Judge Morrison holds territorial court in Red Mesa on the 15th of each month. My father told me that said it was one of the few honest things about that town. Today is the 13th. If we can get there in time, if we can present these papers to him publicly, where everyone can see, then Granger will be the one who's trapped." Tasunke Wikasa stared at her in amazement. The idea was audacious beyond reason, walking directly into Granger's stronghold when every sensible impulse counseled flight toward distant safety. "That's walking straight into the lion's den," Bridger protested. "Granger controls that town completely. You'd be handing yourselves over to him on a silver platter." "Would we?" Clara asked, her strategic thinking impressive for someone so young. "Or would we be forcing him to face us in the one place where the law still means something? Judge Morrison has a reputation for honesty. If these papers prove what Mr. Bridger says they prove, if they really show that my father owned that silver mine, then Granger would be the one breaking the law, not us." The plan that emerged from their desperate counsel was exactly the kind of bold stroke that might succeed where caution and flight had only led to greater danger. They would ride hard for Red Mesa, timing their arrival to coincide with the opening of Judge Morrison's monthly court session. Clara would present her case publicly, using the legal documents as proof of Granger's crimes, while challenging him to dispute her claims before an impartial arbiter of territorial law. If the judge ruled in her favor, if justice actually meant something in the New Mexico territory, then Granger would face federal charges for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. If not, they would all die in the dusty streets of the town where their troubles had begun. But at least their deaths would serve as testimony to the corruption that had infected the territorial government. The ride to Red Mesa took 36 hours of relentless travel, pushing their borrowed horses to the limits of endurance, while staying ahead of Vance's pursuit force that was closing the distance with each passing hour. They reached the outskirts of town, just as the morning sun was painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and crimson, and the sound of hammering from the courthouse square told them that preparations for the monthly court session were already underway. "There," Clara said, pointing toward a canvas pavilion being erected beside the courthouse steps, where Judge Morrison would hold court when the weather permitted outdoor proceedings. "That's where we make our stand, where we finally stop running and start fighting for what's right." Tasunke Wikasa studied the layout of the town with the tactical eye of a warrior who had learned that survival often depended on choosing the right ground for battle. The Silver Horn Saloon dominated one side of the square, its windows already showing signs of activity as Granger's remaining men prepared for what they knew would be a decisive confrontation. Sheriff Vance's office sat across from the courthouse, its jail cells no doubt ready to receive anyone foolish enough to challenge the established order. But there were others in Red Mesa who might be willing to stand up if given the chance and the leadership to do so. Shopkeepers who had been intimidated into paying protection money miners, who had seen their claims stolen through legal manipulation, families who had lost loved ones to Granger's violence, but had been too afraid to speak out until now. "We need witnesses," Tasunke Wikasa said, recognizing that their success would depend as much on popular support as on legal technicalities. "People who will verify your story and support your claim when Granger tries to discredit you." "Murphy," Clara said immediately, her face lighting up with hope at the thought of allies in their desperate gamble. "The stable owner who helped us escape, he knows the truth about what happened. And Mrs. Chen, who runs the laundry, she was kind to me when others looked away. There are good people in Red Mesa, they just need someone to show them that it's safe to stand up for what's right." As they rode into Red Mesa's main street, Tasunke Wikasa could see curtains twitching in windows and faces appearing in doorways as word of their arrival spread through the community like wildfire. They had perhaps minutes before Granger learned of their presence and moved to stop them, which meant their opening gambit had to be perfect and their timing flawless. Judge Morrison was a tall, austere man in his 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of weathered dignity that came from 30 years of frontier law, practiced in places where justice was often decided by the speed of a man's draw rather than the weight of evidence. He had arrived on the morning stage from Santa Fe, bringing with him the authority of the territorial government and a reputation for incorruptible honesty that had made him enemies throughout New Mexico, but had also earned him the respect of those who still believed in the rule of law. When Clara approached the judicial pavilion with a leather pouch clutched in her small hands, a crowd had already gathered to watch the morning's proceedings. Most of the faces showed curiosity mixed with fear, people who wanted to see justice done, but were afraid of the consequences if they showed too much support for the wrong side in Red Mesa's ongoing struggle between law and corruption. "Your Honor," Clara said in a voice that carried clearly across the square. Despite her youth, every word weighted with the dignity of someone who had earned the right to speak through suffering and survival. "I wish to present evidence of murder and fraud committed against my family by men who believed they could kill with impunity because their victims had no one to speak for them." Judge Morrison looked down at the 8-year-old girl with surprise that quickly transformed into professional interest as he recognized the gravity in her manner and the intelligence in her eyes. "Young lady, this is a court of territorial law, not a place for children's grievances or family disputes." "These are not grievances, Your Honor," Clara replied with calm precision that would have done credit to a trained attorney. "These are legal documents that prove my father owned mineral rights to the richest silver strike in the territory. Men murdered him and my mother to steal these papers, and now they want to kill me, to hide their crimes from the justice you represent." The judge's expression grew increasingly serious as Clara removed the documents from their protective pouch and held them up for all to see. Morrison examined the papers carefully, his trained legal eye taking in the official seals, the witness signatures, and the profound implications of what he was reading. While the crowd pressed closer to witness this unprecedented confrontation, meanwhile, across the square, the doors of the Silver-Horned Saloon burst open, and Elias Granger emerged with a dozen armed men behind him, his face flushed with rage and desperation as he saw his carefully constructed empire threatened by the public testimony of the child he had tried so hard to eliminate. The saloon owner's expensive clothes and gold watch chain could not disguise the fact that he was cornered and dangerous, capable of any violence necessary to protect his illegal gains. Judge Morrison Granger called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That girl is a known fugitive, wanted for theft and conspiracy against lawful business interests. She has no standing in your court and no right to make wild accusations against respectable citizens. I'll be the judge of that, Mr. Granger." Morrison replied with the cold precision of someone who would not be intimidated by bluster or threats. "These documents appear to be genuine territorial land grants, and they tell a very interesting story about mineral rights, mysterious deaths, and the ownership of certain silver mining operations that have recently begun production in this area." Sheriff Vance had joined Granger, now his hand resting openly on his pistol butt as he faced the crowd that was growing larger and more restless by the minute. The corrupt lawman's badge caught the morning sunlight, but its gleam could not hide the fact that he served private interests rather than public justice. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Vance said with barely concealed menace, "that Indian there is wanted for the murder of 3 peace officers. He killed them while helping the girl escape from lawful custody, and he represents a clear and present danger to everyone in this courtroom." "What lawful custody was that, Sheriff?" Clara asked, her young voice cutting through the tension like a blade forged from pure truth. "You mean when your men were planning to sell me to Canyon Creek Mining Camp, to work me to death in their kitchens where no one would ask questions about a missing orphan? That's not law enforcement. That's human trafficking." A murmur ran through the crowd at this revelation, and Tasunke Wikasa could see the balance of opinion beginning to shift as people remembered their own experiences with Granger's version of justice. These citizens had suffered under his rule for years, but they had never seen anyone willing to challenge him publicly with evidence that could stand up in a court of law. Furthermore, Clara continued, her confidence growing as she sensed the changing mood of her audience. "Mr. Granger hired the men who murdered my parents on the Santa Fe Trail. He wanted these papers so he could forge my father's signature and claim ownership of our silver mine. When that plan failed, he decided the simplest solution was to eliminate the only witness who could prove his guilt." Granger's face had gone white with rage, his carefully maintained facade of respectability cracking under the pressure of public accusations he could not refute through violence alone. "You can't listen to this nonsense, Judge. She's just a hysterical child filling her head with fantasies and wild conspiracy theories." But Judge Morrison was still studying the documents with the intense focus of someone who understood their legal significance, and his expression was growing darker with each passing moment. "These mineral rights are quite specific, Mr. Granger. They cover the exact geographical area where your new mining operation is currently extracting silver ore. How do you explain that rather remarkable coincidence? I bought those claims fair and square from the Territorial Land Office." Granger protested, but his voice lacked the conviction of truth, and his eyes were already searching for escape routes. "From whom?" the judge pressed relentlessly. "I see no record of legal transfer in these documents, no bill of sale or deed of conveyance. According to these territorial land grants properly witnessed and sealed, Henry Whitfield retained full ownership of all mineral rights until the day he was murdered by persons unknown. It was then that the situation took an unexpected turn. From the crowd emerged Murphy, the Irish stable owner, carrying his old cavalry carbine with the confidence of a man who had decided that the time for neutrality was over. "Your Honor." Murphy called out his voice, carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the truth firsthand. "I can testify to what happened the night this child escaped from Red Mesa. I saw Granger's men trying to kidnap her, planning to sell her to that hellhole at Canyon Creek. This man," he nodded toward Tasunke Wikasa, "saved her life when nobody else would lift a finger to help." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, next her small frame belying the steel in her voice. "Judge Morrison, I seen this child begging for scraps while Granger's people walked past like she was invisible. She never stole nothing from nobody. All she wanted was to survive." More voices joined the miners who had been cheated, shopkeepers who had been extorted, families who had been terrorized. The dam of fear that had held Red Mesa in thrall for years was beginning to crack under the pressure of accumulated grievances, finally finding expression. Granger saw his position becoming untenable and made the same fatal mistake that had brought down countless frontier criminals throughout the West's violent history. Realizing that legal arguments were failing and that his empire was crumbling before his eyes, he chose violence over justice in front of witnesses who could no longer ignore the truth. To hell with this circus. He snarled his hand, moving toward the pistol at his hip. The girl dies here and now, along with anyone fool enough to stand with her against the natural order of things. But the natural order had already changed in Red Mesa's courthouse square. Clara's courage in facing overwhelming odds had given the townspeople permission to remember their own moral convictions and to act on the anger they had been suppressing for years under Granger's reign of terror. As Granger's gun cleared leather, the confrontation that followed unfolded with the swift inevitability of a summer thunderstorm breaking over the desert. Murphy's carbine spoke first, the bullet taking Sheriff Vance between the shoulder blades and dropping him face first into the dust of the street he had corrupted for so long. Mrs. Chen's shotgun boomed like thunder, scattering Granger's remaining supporters and clearing space around the pavilion where the justice was finally being served. Granger himself managed to get off one wild shot that splintered wood from Judge Morrison's bench before Tasunke Wikasa's thrown knife found his throat with the surgical precision of a warrior who had learned to kill efficiently in defense of those who could not protect themselves. The saloon owner dropped his weapon and clutched at the spreading crimson that marked the end of his criminal empire. The remaining gunmen, faced with an aroused populace and a legitimate territorial judge who could call in federal troops to restore order, chose discretion over loyalty to a dead employer. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, begging for mercy from the very people they had helped intimidate and exploit. In the sudden silence that followed the gunfire, Judge Morrison stood up behind his bench and surveyed the scene with the satisfied expression of a man who had witnessed justice truly served after years of watching it perverted by corruption and greed. "Miss Whitfield," he said with formal dignity, his voice carrying across the square to every citizen who had chosen to stand up for what was right. "I hereby recognize your legal ownership of the mineral rights specified in these territorial land grants. Furthermore, I order a full territorial investigation into the deaths of your parents and the criminal conspiracy that sought to defraud you of your rightful inheritance." Clara stood in the center of Red Mesa's courthouse square, no longer the starving waif who had sat outside the Silverhorn Saloon, but a young woman who had fought for her rights under law and emerged victorious. The leather pouch that had nearly cost her life was now the key to a future brighter than anything she could have imagined during those dark days when survival seemed impossible. But as Tasunke Wikasa moved to her side, his protective role transformed but not diminished by their victory. Clara reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small piece of preserved pemmican and the same food he had shared with her on that first day, when no one else in Red Mesa had cared whether she lived or died. "I saved this," she said, simply holding the dried meat out to him with the same solemnity he had shown when sharing his last meal with a hungry stranger. "For when you might need it, because kindness should always be remembered and repaid when possible." The gesture was small, but it represented something larger than any legal victory or financial windfall could provide. It was the completion of a circle of compassion that had begun with a warrior's generosity to a starving child, and ended with justice served and corruption defeated through the courage of people who had chosen to stand together against overwhelming odds. Tasunke Wikasa accepted the offered food with the same reverence he had shown that first day, understanding that some gifts transcended their material value and became symbols of the bonds that connected human beings across all the artificial barriers of race, culture, and circumstance that too often divided communities against themselves. Clara Whitfield was no longer an orphan dependent on charity. She was an heiress to a silver fortune, a survivor of attempted murder, and most importantly, a young woman who understood that true wealth was measured not in ore extracted from the earth, but in the relationships forged through shared struggle and mutual support. The battle for Red Mesa was over. The war for justice in the human heart would continue as long as people chose compassion over indifference, hope over despair, and love over the easy arithmetic of survival. 6 months after the confrontation in Red Mesa's courthouse square, Clara Whitfield stood in the parlor of her newly constructed house overlooking the silver mine that bore her family's name-reading correspondence, while the first snows of winter dusted the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. At 9 years old, she had grown into her role as one of the territory's most influential citizens, but she had never forgotten the lessons learned during those desperate months when survival depended on the kindness of strangers and the courage to stand up for what was right. The Whitfield Mining Company had become a model for the entire territory, providing fair wages, safe working conditions, and profit-sharing arrangements that attracted the best workers from across the Southwest. The Clara Whitfield Home for Children housed 23 orphans and provided education for twice that number from the surrounding communities, ensuring that no child would ever again be left to starve, while adults pursued their own interests. Tasunke Wikasa had found his calling as Clara's business partner and the voice of displaced Native American communities throughout the region. His memoir documenting the complex relationships between white settlers and tribal peoples was nearing completion and would soon offer a perspective on the Indian Wars that few readers had ever encountered. But it was a letter that arrived on the December stage that provided the final piece of their story's puzzle, a communication that revealed just how deeply the connections between past and present ran in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. The letter was from Colonel Frederick Benteen at West Point, and it contained revelations that would forever change how Clara understood her father's work and the circumstances that had brought her and Tasunke Wikasa together. Dear Miss Whitfield and Mr. Tasunke Wikasa, I hope this letter finds you both in continued health and prosperity. The reports of your victory over the Granger organization have reached even these eastern corridors, and I wanted you to know that Captain Custer would have been enormously proud of how his final debt of honor was repaid. There is something more you should know about Henry Whitfield and his connection to the events that shaped your meeting. Your father was not merely a railroad surveyor, Miss Whitfield. He was also a secret correspondent for the War Department, documenting the illegal activities of men like Granger who were profiting from the chaos of territorial expansion. The mineral rights he possessed were part of a larger intelligence operation designed to expose corruption in the Territorial Land Office. His murder was ordered not just to steal valuable mining claims, but to prevent him from testifying before a federal grand jury about systematic fraud involving millions of dollars in fraudulent grants and bribes. The leather pouch you carried, Mr. Tasunke Wikasa, was one Captain Custer asked me to have made by Lakota craftsmen during his time in your territory. He specifically requested that it bear markings that would be recognizable to any Lakota scout who had served with distinction. Your father, Miss Whitfield, asked that his most important documents be kept in such a pouch, knowing that if anything happened to him, it would serve as a signal to the man he most trusted to protect his daughter. The circle of connection between you was planned by two men who understood that honor transcends the boundaries of race and culture, that the best hope for the future lay in cooperation rather than conflict. Captain Custer died believing that someday the bonds forged in battle might contribute to lasting peace between our peoples. Your partnership suggests that his faith was not misplaced. With respect and admiration, Colonel Frederick W. Benteen. Clara looked up from the letter to find Tasunke Wikasa studying the leather pouch that had started their journey together, recognition finally dawning in his dark eyes as he traced the intricate beadwork that had seemed familiar from their first meeting. "He planned it all," she said softly. "My father and Captain Custer, they knew that if something happened, you would be the one to find me. Your father was a wise man." Tasunke Wikasa replied, his voice thick with emotion, as he contemplated the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. He understood that the future belongs to those who choose to build bridges rather than walls. As the winter wind howled outside their warm home, Clara and Tasunke Wikasa sat in comfortable silence, two survivors of a violent world who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances. The silver mine continued to produce wealth that would secure Clara's future and fund charitable works throughout the territory. But their true treasure was simpler and more valuable than any metal extracted from the earth. They had learned that kindness offered without expectation of reward possessed the power to transform lives in ways that no amount of gold or silver could match. They had discovered that courage shown in defense of justice could inspire entire communities to stand up against oppression. Most importantly, they had proven that love, whether between cultures, between strangers, or between a warrior and the child he had chosen to protect, remained the most powerful force for good in a world that often seemed determined to crush such gentle virtues under the weight of harsh necessity. Outside their window, under the lights of Red Mesa twinkled like earthbound stars in the valley below, illuminating a community that had been transformed by their struggle and redeemed by their victory. The town that had once ignored a starving child now ensured that every citizen had food, shelter, and hope for a better tomorrow. Clara Whitfield had become exactly what her parents had dreamed she might be: a force for positive change in a territory struggling to define its character and values. And Tasunke Wikasa had found what he had thought lost forever, a purpose that honored both his heritage and his chosen family, a bridge between the world he had known and the future he was helping to create. The story that had begun with a piece of shared bread had become a testament to the transformative power of human compassion, a demonstration that individual acts of kindness could ripple outward through time and space to create changes far beyond anything their original actors could have imagined. In Red Mesa, New Mexico territory, as the winter of 1876 settled over the high desert and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, two unlikely friends sat by their fire and knew that they had found something rarer and more precious than silver. They had found each other, and through that finding they had discovered that hope once kindled could illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart.